Hey, this is Ocean K with a detailed overview of Chip64, a synth that emulates sound chips from early computers and video game consoles. Now, it isn't just limited to chiptune or arcade-style music, but the sound is definitely based in that origin. So let's start with the chip emulation first. So first off, these are not samples of chip audio. When I started looking at chip synthesis, I discovered pretty quickly that the waveforms were incredibly dynamic. When, for example, the velocity changes, the wave doesn't just scale up and down, but the waveforms themselves change. And same with the pitch, that the cycles aren't just sped up or slowed down, but the waveforms themselves are quite different. So to do an accurate representation with samples, you'd have to do it like a piano, where you're sampling every key at many velocities. But instead, Chip64 mathematically models all of those dynamic changes, which means a couple of things. One, it's very fast. And two, it's really accurate. It sounds great at every pitch and at every velocity. So there are 5 chips that are modeled in the Chip64. Now the first is the TIA chip, which was in the Atari 2600. And the TIA had a handful of waveforms. It had a saw wave, what it called an idle tank. That might sound familiar. It's got an engine, what it called a square wave, a near square. It's got a little edge to that. What it called pitfall, and then a noise. And then a buzz. So those are the waves that came with the TIA chip used in the 2600. The next chip is the SID chip, which was most commonly used in the Commodore 64. The waves that were available on the SID chip were a noise, a pulse wave, a saw wave, what they called a saw wave, a triangle, and those were the waveforms that were available on the SID chip. Now, the SID had a pulse wave, and the pulse width was variable. And so for the SID chip, we do have a pulse wave modulation. Okay. The next chip is a set of chips, the NAO series that was used in Nintendo, the NES system, and the Game Boy. It's got a handful of built-in waves. It's got a 1/16th pulse, a quarter pulse, a half pulse, which is much like a square wave, what it called a short noise, and then what it called a long noise, which is pretty close to a white noise, and then finally a triangle wave. So those were the waves included in the NAO chips. Next we have the VIC-1 chip, which was used in the VIC-20. Now those waveforms, it started with a square wave, and then there were a series of waves that were defined by their binary representation. So so they all sound a little different, but all sort of in the same family. And then finally there was the VIC-1 had its own noise, a pretty unique noise. And then finally the last chip is the SN76 chip, which was used in ColecoVision. It was also one of the chips used in some Sega consoles. And so those waveforms are a square wave, what called a short noise, which was more of a very narrow pulse wave, and then what I call the long noise. Okay, so those are the 5 chips and all the waveforms that are emulated in Chip64. The next thing I want to look at is the sequence section down here. Now, many iconic sounds from arcades were actually sequences of sounds. So for example, if we go to Nintendo, and let's bring up, how about the half pulse or a square wave, I'm going to change the decay, right? Now, if I play a C and a G, but I play it in fast succession, that sounds like the coin sound, right? When Mario gets a coin, it plays, but it plays it in fast succession. Well, the sequence section here allows you to create sequences of notes. So instead of having to play first C and then G and sequence both of those notes separately in the MIDI sequencer, I can say I want a sequence. I want the sequence to be 2 notes long. I'm going to enable the sequence, and I want the second note, right? The first note is the root note, the note that I actually play on the keyboard, and then the second note I want it to be 7 steps up. 7 steps is a fifth. So if I play a G, or I'm sorry, if I play a C, it plays both the C and then the G. So I'm just playing a single note. I'm playing just a C note, but it's playing first the C note and then the G note because that's the sequence. I can change the volume of that second note, right? So it's softer, just as a little echo there, or full volume. I can also change the rate that this sequence plays to very, very, very slow to very fast, where they're essentially playing at the same time. I can also tempo sync. So this does a tempo sync from a full measure up to 1/64th of a measure. Okay. Now, if I wanted a loop that was, or I'm sorry, if I wanted a sequence that was longer, I could have 4 notes, let's say, and this first note is going to be 7 half steps up, and then the next will be 12, and then 4. Now, this 12 is 12 above our root note, not 12 above the 7. And this 4 isn't 4 above the 12, it's the 4 above our root note. So if I just play a C note, I heard 4 notes. If I slow down the rate, you'll hear it a little more clearly. Right, so it plays the root note, in this case C, and then it plays 7 steps up, which is G, and then 12 steps up, which is an octave above our root note, or C, and then 4 steps above our key press, our root note, which is a third, so that's E. So it plays, when I just hold down a C, it plays a C, and then it plays a G, and then it plays a C, and then it plays an E. Speeding that up. Right? So that's a very, very common sound in arcade style sounds, and then it's become a common sound in chiptune. Now this plays just through the sequence and then stops, but you can loop this sequence. So instead of just playing through once, I can loop. Right? And now that starts to sound like a slot machine or something. Every time I loop through, so if I press C, it starts at C again. But I can say offset the entire loop by, let's go up 1 each loop. Right? So every time it repeats the loop, it starts 1 note higher. Or let's start 2 half steps lower. Okay? Now, a lot of these notes are overlapping because I've got a tail, but you can set the poly count, and we'll go over this later, to 1. So now they don't overlap anymore. Or you can set it to however many you want, and they will overlap. So that's the sequence section. You enable a sequence, you've got 3 extra notes, so for a sequence of 4 notes total, you can loop that sequence and offset the loop each time, and then you can set the rate as free running or tempo sync. Okay, so that's the sequence. Next, I want to look at the filter here because it's kind of a special filter. So this is a 7-mode, a multi-mode bi-quad filter, which is kind of complicated, but it just means that it's got a number of different types of filters, and the filters can be dialed in different ways. So in terms of types, we've got a low-pass filter, a high-pass filter, a band pass, a notch, or a band reject, a parametric, a low shelf, and a high shelf. And so in terms of variables here, we can change the frequency, and we can change the gain, and we can change the Q, or the slope. Now, one thing that makes this filter special is I didn't put any artificial limits on this. So commonly you'll have a filter that'll go down, to 40 or 60 or 100 hertz, and then it'll go up to maybe 200 kilohertz or 20 kilohertz or something like that. But those are kind of artificial distinctions, or for artificial limitations. And I didn't want to do that. So the frequency range goes from subsonic to supersonic. And the slope, or the Q, goes from 0 to infinity. So what this ends up meaning is that you can do some very surgical cuts or boosts, or very gentle boosts over the entire frequency range, or do some really interesting things. It also means that this filter can be overdriven pretty easily. So let's take a look. Let's look at the Nintendo Long Noise, and I'm using this because this tends to have a pretty decent spectrum. So let's bring this up, right? So we can see it's not perfect. It's got a little dip here, but generally it's pretty good. So we can see what our filter is going to do. So if we start with a low pass filter, right? So we see we can get, a complete cut of that high end there. Now the Q is the slope. So that determines how fast it runs off. So with a very low Q, it's a very gentle curve, right? But with a high Q, or a high slope, it starts to get a little more extreme. Well, as you get more extreme, you start to overdrive the filter. And so then it starts to resonate, right? So you start to get that sort of sounds, right? And that's a sound of an overdriven filter. Really high resonance in that case. Because it's overdriven, it also doesn't do a great job of cutting, but that's what you get when you overdrive a filter. It stops being quite as functional, and instead creates pretty unique sounds. For the low pass, the high pass, the band pass, and the notch, gain doesn't do anything. It's not a factor. For those particular filters, all you care about are the filters and the slope. We can look at, for example, the high pass. Let's cut that Q down. Right, so we can get a very gentle slope, or we can get a very extreme slope that starts to overdrive. Let's look at band pass, right? So this is if you wanted to just isolate a very specific band, you can do that, and the higher the Q, the narrower that band is. So you can get an extremely narrow band, right? Where it's essentially just letting through a single frequency. And when you get it to infinity, you're getting just, a very, very narrow band. Or you can do a band pass with a very low Q, in which case it's letting this entire band come through. All right, let's move to the parametric. Now, a parametric is sort of like the M-class EQ, where the gain does matter. So a negative gain is a cut, and a positive gain is a boost. So if we've got a parametric, which is just a single point, it's sort of like a band pass. We can do a cut, right? So it's cutting this frequency right here, or we can do a boost for that particular frequency. And again, this can be overdriven, or it can be a very sort of gentle curve. And then finally, we've got a low shelf and a high shelf. So low shelves and high shelves have a standard slope, so Q isn't used in low shelf and high shelf. Instead, all that's used is the frequency, and whether you want it to be a cut or whether you want it to be a boost, and how much of a cut and boost. Okay. So that's the filter. It's a pretty aggressive filter without any artificial limitations. So you can get a really wide frequency range, a very extreme slope or resonance. It's a pretty aggressive filter, so it's pretty fun to play with. Okay, so that's the filter. Let's go through the rest of these one by one. So our notes section, we've got a 9 octave range for our octave, so 4 below and 4 up. We've got a 2 octave range, so 12 notes below and 12 notes down and 12 notes up. And then we've got a fine pitch, which is down 100 cents and up 100 cents. We've got a portamento, so you can set a portamento for however long you want. We talked earlier about a poly count, so this is how many notes are playing at any particular time. So one poly count is a monosynth, and then everything above that is a polysynth, and you can decide how many voices. And then there's the pulse width. Again, this is only used for the SID pulse waveform because of these 5 chips, that is the only chip and waveform that supports a user-defined pulse width. For our envelope, we've got a standard ADSR envelope. The attack, decay, and release have times from 0 to 2 seconds. And then next we've got an LFO. So the LFO has 6 waveforms: a sine, triangle, ramp, reverse ramp, square, and exponential. You can set the scale of the LFO, so that's sort of the amplitude of the LFO. And then it's got targets. So in this case, we've got 8 different targets. You can target the pitch or the volume, or some of the frequency attributes, or some of the sequences, the sequence rate, stuff like that. So for example, if I'm going to reset this device, and if I set my destination, we can start with just pitch, and we'll bring the scale up. Right? We can also, for example, do the volume. The rate is free running and tempo synced. Okay. Next we have performance. So this is, you've just got a pitch bend wheel with the range from 1 to 12 steps. We've got a mod wheel, and this mod wheel has 7 destinations. It's got some of the filters, and it can change the LFO and the pulse width and sequencer rate. Now the scale here, similar to the LFO, where it sets the amplitude from 0 to 100, but the performance scale can go from 0 to 100 and also 0 to negative 100, which produces an inverse signal out of here. So if instead of the the filter frequency, if scale is set to 100 and you increase the mod, you increase the frequency. But if scale is set to a negative number, like negative 100, you increase mod and it decreases the frequency. So you can get some nice inverse mod going on there. Next, we have a modulation envelope. So it's got its own ADSR. The ADSR is triggered by global notes that come into the Chip64, but it can run its own envelope. It looks like 9 destinations. So again, pitch, some of the filters, the LFO, the volumes, some other things as well. And again, just like the mod wheel, the modulation envelope can go to positive 100 and also negative 100. So this can give you some inverse envelopes. And we talked about the sequence section. One other thing is the master section. So this is the master volume, of course. And then there's an oversampling. So by default, there is no oversampling on Chip64, but you can add oversampling if you want. And there's a low setting and a high setting. And this, you can just see how your computer works with the level of oversampling. For all the computers that I've been testing on, this is Chip64 has a very low DSP footprint. So oversampling at high usually is not a problem at all. So for example, right, so this is high oversampling, and I've got a single bar of DSP usage, right? But if I bring oversampling off, then 3 notes just gives me a single bar, 3 notes, starts to get up there. So you can just see how much oversampling you need. For percussion sounds and bass sounds and often mid-frequency sounds, you really won't need oversampling. If you're doing really high notes, sometimes it becomes useful. You start to hear that aliasing, so you can get rid of it. Low oversampling actually gets rid of about 95% of the aliasing. So generally that should be fine. It's only when you're doing really extreme high frequency work that you might want to bump it up to high. So that's the front of the Chip64. Let's look at the back. So the back has, it's got a standard audio stereo out. It's also got audio in. So if you wanted to combine some other, sample or something with the audio from the Chip64, you can do that. You just feed that audio in. You can also use the Chip64's filter on external audio. So you can just feed that audio in and not create any sounds with the Chip64, but just use this filter to work on that external audio. Then in terms of CV outs, we've got a gate and note out. So this is just a standard, this sends out MIDI signals corresponding to your key presses or the MIDI notes. So whereas this is a sequence gate and a sequence note. So for example, let's say I have a sequence. We're going to pull the poly down. We'll loop that. Right? So I've got a sequence here, and I'm just holding down a C note. On the back, this gate note out is just sending that C note, right? So this is so if you wanted to trigger maybe some external envelope or something else where you just want to trigger it based on how long you're holding down a note. Whereas this sequence gate and sequence note, this sends out the gate and note signals of every note played in the sequence. So for example, if you liked this sequence section, but you actually wanted it to run on, let's say, a subtractor, right? So when I play the Chip64 and I just hold down a C note, if I send that gate and CV out, I can turn down the Chip64 volume and now I'm sending notes to the Chip64, but the Chip64 is sending out gate information to the subtractor and the subtractor is making sound. But if I change this note to the sequence and I hold down just a C key, now the subtractor is playing those sequence notes. Right? So that's pretty cool. You can use this sequencer to run external synths. I think that's cool. Okay, back to Chip64. So we've got our gates outs for our key presses and then our gate and note out for our sequence. We've also got the LFO out and the mod envelope out in case you wanted to use those on external sources. Then in terms of CV in, we've got the standard gate and note. So this is if you wanted to use external triggers like the Matrix or the RPG8 or something like that. We've also got an envelope in. So if you wanted to use an external envelope, you could do that. You could use Thor, which can send out nice envelopes. There are also third parties like Charlotte, which is a great envelope generator. So you can use Charlotte to go into envelope, and then you can have a multi-stage envelope affecting the notes of Chip64. We also have 4 generic CV inputs. So these can be routed to, I don't know whether it's 12 destinations or targets. So you can have an external CV signal change any of these variables, any of these knobs essentially. Okay. You can also send multiple CVs to the same destination, in which case the CV signals will just be merged and both of them will have an effect. So this also allows you to do sort of an onboard CV merging between signals. So that's the back of the Chip64, and in fact that's pretty much the overview of the entire device. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at reinfo@oceank.com, and I'll put a link to that email address in the description to this video and on the Propellerhead shop page. I hope you have fun with Chip64. Thanks for watching.